You know his voice. You've heard it on dozens of songs, maybe hundreds. It's been the backbone of tracks that defined your summers, your heartbreaks, your drives through the city at night. But if someone asked you to name 5 Nate Dogg songs, songs where he was the artist and not just the guest, you'd probably struggle. That's not your failure. That's the design. Because Nate Dogg was the most valuable tool in hip-hop history, and like most tools, he was used until he broke. Then he was forgotten. And if you think that's an exaggeration, stay with me. Because what happened to Nathaniel Hale is the blueprint for how the music industry extracts everything from those who can't protect themselves. Before we go further, make sure you subscribe to Legends Underrated, because we're telling the stories that everyone else wants to bury. Nathaniel Dwayne Hale was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi in 1969, but his story really begins in Long Beach, California. His family moved west when he was young, settling into a city that would later become synonymous with a particular kind of smooth, menacing sound. Nate grew up singing in church, and that foundation, that gospel training, became the core of everything he would later create. While other kids in Long Beach were learning to rap, Nate was learning harmony, learning how to make a melody feel like both a promise and a threat. That duality, that ability to sound comforting and dangerous at the same time, would become his signature. It would also become his prison. At Long Beach Poly High School, Nate met Calvin Broadus, who would become Snoop Dogg, and Warren Griffin, who would become Warren G. The three of them formed a group called 213, named after the area code, and they started making music in bedrooms and garages. They were kids, but they understood something fundamental about the West Coast sound that was beginning to emerge. It needed melody. It needed something to soften the edges of the violence and the paranoia that ran through the streets. Nate's voice became that softening agent, that spoonful of sugar that made the medicine go down. When Warren G produced Regulate in 1994, Nate Dogg's chorus didn't just make the song memorable, it made the song possible. Regulate was more than a hit. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that Nate's voice could transform a good song into an unforgettable one. The hook became a cultural touchstone, something people quoted, something people sang at parties, something that outlived the summer it was released. And in the aftermath of that success, a pattern began to form. Artists started calling, producers started reaching out. Everyone wanted Nate on their track because Nate's voice was a guarantee. It was a stamp of authenticity, a signal to listeners that this song was serious, that it mattered. And Nate, still young, still hungry, said yes to almost everything. Why wouldn't he? This was the dream, wasn't it? To be in demand, to be valued, to be part of something bigger than himself. But there's a difference between being valued and being compensated. There's a difference between being essential and being prioritized. Nate signed with Death Row Records in 1995, at the height of the label's power and chaos. He released his debut album, G-Funk Classics, Volumes 1 and 2, in 1998, and it was solid, showcasing his range and his ability to carry a track on his own. But Death Row was imploding, torn apart by violence and mismanagement and greed. The promotional machine that should have pushed Nate to stardom was busy dealing with lawsuits and funerals. His album came and went without the support it deserved. Meanwhile, his features, his guest appearances on other people's songs kept climbing the charts. He was on tracks with Dr. Dre, Eminem, Snoop, Ludacris, Pharoah Monch, Fabulous, and dozens of others. Every one of those songs needed him more than he needed them, but the credits didn't reflect that. The checks didn't reflect that either. By the early 2000s, Nate Dogg had become the industry's favorite secret weapon. If your song needed a hook, you called Nate. If your album needed credibility, you called Nate. He appeared on Eminem's Shake That, on Ludacris's Area Codes, on Fabulous's Can't Deny It, on 50 other tracks that defined the era. His voice was everywhere, inescapable, woven into the fabric of mainstream hip-hop. But his solo career remained stagnant. His second album, Music and Me, dropped in 2001 and barely made a ripple. His third album, Nate Dogg, came out in 2003 and suffered the same fate. The industry had figured out the formula. Why invest in Nate Dogg the artist when you could rent Nate Dogg the feature? Why build his brand when you could borrow his voice for a fraction of the cost? The mathematics were brutal and efficient, and Nate, who just wanted to make music, who just wanted to provide for his family, kept saying yes. He kept saying yes, even as the toll began to show. Even as the relentless schedule, the constant travel, the pressure to deliver on demand started wearing him down. Because what choice did he have? This was his livelihood. This was how he fed his children. And so he sang night after night, session after session, lending his gift to songs that would make other people wealthy and famous while he struggled to keep up with his bills. The industry calls this collaboration. The industry calls this paying your dues. But there's another word for it, a simpler word, and that word is extraction. In December of 2007, Nate Dogg suffered a stroke. He was only 38 years old. The stroke left him partially paralyzed, struggling to speak, unable to perform. For an artist whose entire value was tied to his voice, this was a catastrophic blow. The news barely registered in the industry press. There were no benefit concerts, no fundraisers, no major labels stepping up to cover his medical expenses. A few friends checked in, a few collaborators sent their regards, but mostly there was silence. The machine that had used him so thoroughly had no mechanism for giving back. Nate began the slow, painful process of rehabilitation, relearning how to move, how to speak, how to exist in a body that had betrayed him. And then, just as he was beginning to recover, just as he was starting to imagine a future where he could sing again, he had another stroke. The second stroke came in September of 2008, and it was worse than the first. This time, the paralysis was more severe, the damage more extensive. Nate's ability to perform, already compromised, was now almost entirely gone. He could barely speak. He couldn't walk without assistance. The voice that had defined an era, that had elevated countless artists, was reduced to a whisper. And still, the industry moved on. New hooks, new features, new voices to exploit. Nate Dogg became a memory, a name people mentioned with nostalgic affection but no urgency. He was still alive, still fighting, still trying to survive. But to the business that had built itself on his back, he was already gone. The years that followed were a slow erosion. Medical bills piled up, unpaid and insurmountable. Nate's family struggled to keep him comfortable, to provide the care he needed, but the money wasn't there. The royalties from all those features, all those hits, weren't structured to support a man who could no longer work. The contracts he'd signed, the deals he'd made in good faith, were designed to protect everyone but him. Friends helped where they could, but friendship doesn't pay for round-the-clock nursing care. Friendship doesn't cover the cost of medications and therapies and the endless, grinding expenses of long-term illness. Nate spent his final years trapped in a body that wouldn't cooperate, dependent on others, watching the world he'd helped build continue without him. On March 6, 2011, Nate Dogg died from complications related to his strokes. He was 41 years old. The tributes poured in immediately, effusive and heartfelt. Snoop Dogg called him the best hook singer in the world. Dr. Dre praised his unique talent. Eminem, Ludacris, Warren G, and dozens of others posted their condolences, sharing memories of working with him, marveling at his gift, The tributes were genuine. There's no reason to doubt that, but they were also too late. They were also insufficient. Because where were these voices when Nate was struggling? Where were these powerful, wealthy artists when their friend was drowning in medical debt? The tributes felt less like mourning and more like absolution, a collective attempt to feel better about a system that had failed him completely. After his death, the features continued to get played. The songs he'd sung on kept generating revenue, kept getting streamed, kept soundtracking commercials and movies and video games. Money kept flowing, but it flowed to record labels, to producers, to everyone except the family Nate left behind. His children, his loved ones, were left to navigate a world where their father's voice was worth millions, but his life had been disposable. The industry that had extracted everything from Nate Dogg in life continued to extract from him in death, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The contracts were ironclad. The system was designed exactly for this. And here's what makes it unbearable. Nate Dogg's story isn't unique. He's not an outlier, not an unfortunate exception to an otherwise fair system. He's the blueprint. The music industry has always operated on extraction, on finding people with extraordinary gifts and using them until there's nothing left. It's found ways to make this seem normal, even noble. It calls it collaboration. It calls it building a legacy. But strip away the language, strip away the mythology, and what you're left with is simple. You're left with a man who gave everything, who elevated everyone he worked with, who created something irreplaceable, and who died broke and broken while others got rich off his gift. You're left with a voice that will echo forever in songs that bear other people's names. You're left with a moral debt that will never be paid. Listen to Area Codes again, or Regulate, or the next episode, or any of the dozens of tracks Nate blessed with his presence. Listen to how essential he is, how the entire structure of the song collapses without him. Then ask yourself who profited. Ask yourself who's still profiting. Ask yourself why the man who made all of it possible died in circumstances that the money his work generated could have prevented. There's no satisfying answer. There's only the reality of a system that values product over people, that treats artists as assets to be leveraged and discarded. Nate Dogg was the most important voice in hip-hop for nearly 2 decades, and the industry thanked him by forgetting him the moment he couldn't perform anymore. His legacy lives on in the music, and that's something that's real. Every time someone discovers Regulate for the first time, every time a producer tries to capture that smooth, menacing tone, Nate's influence ripples forward. But legacy isn't justice. Legacy doesn't pay for the care he needed. Legacy doesn't compensate his family for what was taken. The industry will keep using his blueprint, keep finding new voices to exploit, keep extracting until there's nothing left, unless something fundamental changes. Unless people start asking questions, start demanding better, start refusing to accept that this is just how things work. Nate Dogg deserved better. Every artist who comes after him deserves better. And if you've made it this far, if this story has moved you or angered you or made you think differently about the music you love, then do something with that feeling. Subscribe to Legends Underrated, share this story, and remember that every song has a human cost. Make sure that cost isn't invisible anymore.